Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Historical Linguistics 2 here at LSA Virtual 2021. We will be beginning our session today with a presentation titled A Variationist Account of Differential Object Marking as a Contact Feature in Paraguay and Guarani, presented by Josefina Pitar, representing the University of New Mexico. Josefina, on you.
Thank you. Second. All right. So you can see my screen now. Right? Yeah. Cool. All right. So thank you everyone for being here and for your interest in my research. My name is Josefina Vitar, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Linguistics Department at the University of New Mexico. So today I'll be talking about differential object marking as a contact feature, or I should say a presumed contact feature in Paraguay and Guarani. And I will use variationist data to provide evidence for the contact hypothesis. So, okay, the objective of this talk is to try to answer these two questions. Is differential object marking a contact feature in Guarani, and has been proposed by the previous literature? And the second question, which I know is a bold question to ask, is if this is a contact feature, how was this borrowed? So, of course, when we talk about contact features, we have to talk about universals. We have to talk about linguistic universals. So differential object marking is the variation in overt marking in a language's direct objects. And there are many strategies and many factors that influence this variation in overt marking in a given language. So, of course, object animacy is a very famous one. Spanish has this. So Spanish marks human direct objects, but it doesn't mark, at least not generally, direct objects that do not have a human reference. Definiteness is another factor, and specificity of the object as well. Now, although these are common factors across the world's languages, as proposed by many researchers, Sinemaki finds in his cross-linguistic study that there isn't a single universally significant factor that will predict the occurrence of the differential marker. That said, he does find that there is a tendency in the worst languages to have DOM, to have differential object marking than not. So it is more common to find a language that has differential object marking than a language that does not have differential object marking. And of course, because differential object marking is such a common feature across the world's languages, then the contact hypothesis can be a little bit weak because it's such a common feature. Then the language might have developed this feature on its own, regardless of the language it's been in contact with. So one of the last issues of the Journal of Language Contact actually addresses this question, the differential object marking in contact, and they propose that there is a symmetrical and asymmetrical scenario. So in symmetrical cases, there are two languages that influence each other. And in the asymmetrical scenarios, in many cases, there are languages that, one language that has differential object marking, another language that doesn't have differential object marking, and this DOM-less language borrows the DOM from this other language, which is the case that I will talk about today. And how does this happen? So they, in this issue, they talk about replication in the sense of Matras and Seiko, who talk about grammatical borrowing as being pattern and the borrowing of pattern, the function of a certain linguistic item, and the borrowing of matter, which includes the form. So what they find in DOM and context studies is that it's usually the case, it's more often the case that the pattern, the function is borrowed, but not the form. And this, of course, is a lot harder to prove in terms of contact because, I mean, it's hard to prove that a language is borrowing a function. So another proposed explanation is contact-induced grammaticalization, and actually Rodriguez Ordóñez in this issue talks about Basque coming up with differential object marking as a result of contact-induced grammaticalization, the contact language being Spanish. So these are the editors of the issue, in the Journal of Language Contact. So, well, how does DOM in Spanish work? So, Guarani has been in contact with Spanish for 500 years. So, of course, we have to talk about Spanish, which is a presumed donor language. Of course, animacy is a big factor in differential object marking in Spanish. Also, verb semantics and relative animacy, which what basically this means is that if the object is higher in animacy than the subject, which is not prototypical, then the object will get marked because we want to make sure that our interlocutor knows that, okay, these are two people. They're both equally capable of performing the same action. So we want you to make sure that this one is the object. So, of course, in most varieties of Spanish, we have to use the marker when we have a human reference. So I know your mother, you need that a there, that is the differential object marker. In most varieties of Spanish, I know that there are varieties of Spanish that where this sentence is grammatical, but in many varieties of Spanish, it's not. So you do need that a. Now, in Guarani, you can have the marker be, which is also, so a is also in Spanish a locative preposition. It indicates direction. In Guarani, be is a postposition that refers to also location, to place. It means in. Sorry. But this is acceptable as well. So what I want to do, or what one of the goals of this research project is to say, okay, what determines if we get the marker or not? So animacy, Shannon Tonhauser found that it's relevant to determine the occurrence of the marker in Guarani, as well as topicality. And Bosong also claims that relative animacy, just like in Spanish, is also relevant in this language. Okay, so how do we answer the contact question? So I stem from a usage-based approach to language contact, and some of the most recent approaches have claimed, well, if we find that there are elements that are frequently used together in fixed expressions and idiomatic expressions, and even in less fixed expressions, we're probably going to see that these items that are frequently used together will be borrowed together by the recipient language as well. So I came up with these two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is, okay, if elements are being borrowed together, then maybe a loan verb will predict the occurrence of the differential object marker. So basically in this sentence, which does not have a loan verb, because hija is a native origin verb, it means to leave, then we won't get the differential object marker. But in this other sentence, where you can see alone from Spanish, castiga from Spanish to punish, we do see the differential object marker. So I tested this hypothesis. And the second hypothesis was, okay, maybe it has to do with a loan noun, with a loan that's being suffixed by the marker. So in this sentence, because we don't have a differential, because we don't have a loan, that is, the noun is not a loan, then we do not get the marker. However, in this sentence, that does have a loan, familia, it also means children. We do see the marker B occurring there. So what I did then is I used 40 unscripted interviews. They're all an hour long. I interviewed women and men from rural and urban areas of Paraguay. The age range goes from 18 to 85. They're all native speakers of Guarani. Most of them are bilingual. In fact, most of the population of Paraguay is currently bilingual in Guarani and Spanish. And also, younger speakers are more fluent in Spanish than their older peers. So I extracted tokens with full direct objects. That is, I didn't look at direct objects that were pronouns, because pronouns don't get the marker. And I extracted tokens whose Spanish translation would require the use of the marker a. And I did this because while looking at the data, I realized that if the Guarani, the Guarani sentence never had the marker if its Spanish translation would not require the marker. And then I did a logistic regression. Of course, the linguistic factors were the ones that I predicted would be significant: the language origin of the verb and the language origin of the noun, that is native origin versus loan, and the social information of the speaker, so their age, sex, and location. So I extracted a total of 613 tokens. 44% of them were marked. That is, so just to have Spanish as a reference, if these were Spanish tokens, 100% of them would be marked. So, of course, this feature is a lot less frequent in Guarani than it is in Spanish. And B, the marker occurs more often when it suffixes a Spanish loan. So my second hypothesis was corroborated. However, I know it's not highly significant. Well, I have to be careful with the interpretation of this result. And also, this was surprising. The speaker, when the speaker is younger, then the more likely they are to use a marker, or they use a marker at a higher rate. And this was, of course, highly significant, as you can see from this scatter plot here. The younger the speaker, the more likely they are to use a marker. Okay. Now, another interesting finding, and this was completely unexpected, to be honest, was that when looking at the referent of the object, I noticed that adult referents were getting the marker a lot more often than child object reference that with children, or children as reference. So as you can see, 25% of the tokens that had a child as an object were marked versus 55% of adults. And because most speakers, they talk about themselves. So most of the tokens, the subject is a first person. And because all of my interviewees are adults, then we're talking about adult, and like adult as a subject, adult as an object, adult as a subject, and child as an object. So I'm going to give you an example. This verb feed, right? And I was looking at these tokens again today, and all of the tokens of feed are used in the metaphoric, in the figurative sense. That is, I provide for someone, not necessarily to feed, like literally feeding someone with a spoon or something. So there are 5 tokens of feed in the corpus, and 2 of them have adults as object reference, and 3 of them have children. So the marker appears 100% of the time. So in both tokens of adult objects, the marker occurs. But when it comes to the children tokens, then only one of them gets marked, so one out of 3. So this is an example of someone talking about how they worked at the marker to feed, or should I say, to provide for their mom and other people in the family. So you can see the marker there after mama and after umia. But this one, the object is familia, which again means child or children, and you do not see the marker. And this is interesting because even though this is a loan, it doesn't get the marker. So the way I'm interpreting these results is that this pattern has to do with relative animacy, because like an adult feeding or providing for another adult is less prototypical than an adult providing for a child. Therefore, the speaker needs to use the marker to show who is feeding whom. Okay, so is a differential object marker a feature in Guarani? And how was it borrowed? These are the 2 original questions of this study. I think that the fact that the marker occurs more often with a loan than with a native origin word might provide evidence for the fact that DOM is a contact feature, because otherwise, why would this matter? And how was it borrowed? Oh, sorry. And also the fact that younger speakers who are more fluent bilinguals use it at a higher rate, I think also provides evidence for the contact hypothesis. Okay, and about the second question, I think that this fits nicely with the replication of pattern proposed by Montrose and Seiko. And I think this pattern is probably maybe primed by the loan noun that is suffixed by the marker. So, well, even though it's lovely to work with naturalistic data, I acknowledge that it has limitations because there are many things that I can't control for. So the next step for this research project is to have elicitation tasks so that I can control for more factors, especially linguistic factors, like word order, which appears to be relevant. It is, of course, relevant in Spanish. That has been tested in Spanish. Person tense and aspect as well. And if you have any more ideas and other factors that I should control for, of course, these suggestions and comments are welcome. So thank you very much for your time. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
All right. Thank you, Josefina. Great times, great times. We'll open the floor for questions and such things. You can either use the raise hands feature in the chat, or you can use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We'll do either of those. And we have approximately 12 minutes for discussion. Okay. We have a question from Rosa Vallejos. Do you think that the age of the loans, for example, do verbs that entered Guarani long ago behave in the same way that more recent loans? In any case, what is your operational definition of loan in a scenario with such a long history of contact?
Um, okay, so well, that's a really good question. To think about it, so I consider loan anything that comes from Spanish that that has a Spanish-like form. I didn't consider age of the loan, and I think that's going to be relevant. It's going to be it should be very interesting. Now, how would I operationalize that? Um, like accounting for the age of the loan, I think that's going to be a challenge, especially that there isn't a long. Well, there are resources of course, old Guarani, but not um, not a lot, of course. And but what was the other part of the question? Um,
Says, let's see. In any case, what is your operational definition of a loan in a scenario with such a long history of contact?
okay, so that was a question. So I think anything that resembled Spanish in terms of form, that counted to me as alumni. No, it's not that's not a great definition. Um, and I also know that there are loans that are a lot more integrated. I think some of these loans in Guarani, I know that native speakers don't know that they're loans from Spanish. Some of them they do know that they're loans, but some of them I mean they're so old that people don't really know these are loans from Spanish. Um, so yes. Um, I think there was a second part of this question, but I can't remember. Well, I can talk to Rosa later too.
Okay, sounds good. So we'll move on to another question from Davin. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. They say in Tupi, pay functions as the locative marker in on or at. Does pay have this function in Guarani as well, in addition to marking animate definite objects? And if so, could it be significant that the Spanish marker a exhibits this same polysemy?
Yes. So now I just realized that I can read the questions myself. Uh, so anyway,
Go for it.
so that's useful. Yes, I absolutely think that cannot be a coincidence, and that's another. I mentioned it briefly in my presentation. Maybe I should, because somebody mentioned this to me also. I think I should make it another like piece of evidence as well, because pe it means in, on, at. In Spanish is also a locative preposition, just like pe. So yes, I think it's significant. It means something.
Okay, wonderful. We have a third question. Josefina, you can read it or I can. It's up to you.
Okay.
From Ichazo. Yes. Um,
Okay.
to the
Yes,
rest. Oh, go ahead.
I think so. The Shane and Tonhauser article is actually the one that inspired me to do this project because, well, Bosong before them noticed that fit does not occur in 16th, 17th century texts. So they noticed that this feature is relatively recent in Guarani because it hasn't been documented, and even if you go as far as the 18th, 19th century, it's not there in text. Of course, these are written texts. We, of course, do not know what people were doing with spoken language, but I think that's also, and that's the Bosong and Shane and Tonhauser's main argument for the contact hypothesis or the contact explanation for DOM in Guarani is that it's not there when you look at alt text. Okay, the second question, different kinds of bilinguals. Yes, this is something that I will definitely incorporate when I do elicitation tasks to have a more like formal assessment of different kinds of bilinguals. I did somewhat accounted for that in terms when I looked at location. So urban areas in Paraguay are a lot more influenced by Spanish. So Spanish is a lot more spoken in urban areas compared to rural areas. But also, if you go to rural areas of Paraguay and you, so for example, if you interview older speakers, this is something that happened to me. Like they would like, oh, we want to interview you, we want to talk to you. And because they knew I was from Asuncion, which is the capital of Paraguay, they would be like, I don't speak Spanish. Like yo no hablo castellano. They would say that to me, but this never happened with younger speakers. With younger speakers, the default language is Spanish wherever you go in Paraguay. But with older speakers, they would speak Guarani to you, and they would apologize for not speaking Spanish. So I think the age also can determine, or age can be a proxy, let's say, for types of bilingualism. But again, that said, when I do elicitation tasks, I will have people complete a survey or tell me more about the language practices or language usage.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. Did you also answer the question if DOM is stigmatized in Guarani? Did you answer that question?
What question?
Last question from
Oh,
Ichaso: is DOM stigmatized in Guarani?
no, I don't think so. Somebody asked me this question as well, and I have to say no. And I think it's one of because loans are. So if you use Spanish loans in Guarani, they're somewhat stigmatized. But with this presumed grammatical borrowing, I think it goes unnoticed. People are completely unaware of this, I assume. And I also think that because this is I think it's good that I have naturalistic data, because sometimes when you ask people to translate something from Spanish, they would use be, because they're translating from Spanish. So it sort of it primes this use of the marker when they're translating from Spanish, but I don't think I think it goes completely unnoticed.
Wonderful.
Another thing that, okay, I don't know if I have more time, but another thing that I want to do maybe sometime in the future is to look at written text, like contemporary written text, because my guess is that the rate of the marker usage is a lot higher than in spoken data, because I don't know, people when they're writing, my idea is that they're thinking like the Spanish is more activated than when they're speaking, so they might think, oh, I have to use be here because it's a human direct object or something like
Okay, wonderful. We have to move along. There was a general question in the chat. Do you have a handout that you can share with everybody later on? No handout? No, saying, Josefina, do you have a handout that you can share later on?
that. Oh, okay. Sorry, there are many comments here.
Okay.
A handout. I mean, yeah, I can share my presentation with you. Does that count as a handout?
I think that'll work.
The PDF of the presentation? Yeah, totally. Let me write down your name.
Okay. While you do that, I'll go ahead and thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful, and I think everybody can reach out to you later on if you have more things to say. So we'll move right along with our next presentation. Um, as a reminder, if you're here for the presentation about loanword markers, that one will be our last presentation for this session. So we're going to move on to our next talk, titled Pronominal Clitics in Tocharian B and Their Implications for Split Intransitivity, presented by Daigo Onishi from University of California, Los Angeles. Daigo, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thank you. I'm going to share my slides, and uh, my slides are available from the link that I posted. Can you see my slides? Okay, so thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about pronominal critics in Tokarian B. So Tokarian B finite verbs can host at most one pronominal critic. So example one shows that we have a third person singular critic ne, which represents a direct object of paratai you praised x. So you singular have never forgotten to protect the moral behavior. You singular praised him, namely the Buddha, for 7 days with a single strophe. A PC can also represent a direct object, an indirect object, or an alienable or inalienable possessor. So example 2 illustrates that uh, the plural critic me that represents a indirect object of aksha she or he proclaimed X to Y. So the Buddha proclaimed this strophe to them, saying, whatever good or evil deed living beings do here, and so on. The next example shows that first person singular critic nu spells out an inalienable possessor of Kekten body. So even if all beings crush my bones small like dust, or if they chop up my body, and so. Um, PCs in Tocharian are interesting because they do not resemble pronominal critics of ancient Indo-European languages such as Hittite or Vedic Sanskrit or Avestan, where critics have IO and DO distinction and they all target the C region. How Tocharian developed PCs is not known to us. Payroll 2019 has proposed that contact with Raric has played a role, but many details still need to be worked out. It is without doubt that better understanding of PCs in Tocharian will be beneficial for our better understanding of the diagram. Previous Sperry treatments of the PCs in Tocharian B thought that they can represent whatever genitive dative and accusative can represent. Today, I'm going to challenge this view. So the goal of today's talk is as follows. In this talk, I'm going to show that the PCs in Tokarian B are more restricted than previously thought. That is, they cannot spell out a possessor associated with an external argument. And this analysis has some implications. PCs can be used as a diagnostics for unaccusativity in this language. They can be associated with an unaccusative subject, but they cannot be associated with an unaccusative subject. The structure of my talk is as follows. In the next section, I'm going to introduce you some basic background of Tocharian and some assumptions that my analysis is based on. And in section 3, I'm going to proceed to my own analysis, which has some implications. Section 5 concludes this paper. Tocharian B is an Indo-European language which belongs to Tocharian branch. It was spoken about 5th to 7th century CE in Xinjiang, China. It is attested mostly in Buddhist manuscripts. Pronominal critics in Tocharian B do not have case distinction. They do not have person distinction plural either, and they are tense aspect model invariant. And it is known that pronominal critics in Tocharian B are multifunctional. They can spell out a direct object, an indirect object, or an alienable or inalienable possessor, and so on. The basic word order of Tocharian is SOV. Finite verbs can host at most one pronominal critic. PCs always follow a finite verb, and therefore they violate Greenberg's universal 25, which states if the pronominal object follows the verb, so does the nominal object. Ashton 2011 has an analysis on this topic. Unfortunately, today I'm not going to discuss critic doubling and critic left or right dislocation. This is a topic for a different opportunity. In this talk, I'm going to assume that a pronominal critic is a phi minimum and maximum consisting of interpretable phi features only. So I'm going to follow cardinality and Starker's and others. And I'm also going to assume that small v has a set of unvalued phi features whose values are supplied by the valued phi features of a goal. So I'm going to follow the probe-goal model of Chomsky 2000. And if the goal is defective in the sense of Roberts 2010, it undergoes incorporation to the probe. So Roberts 2010 has described that a goal G is defective if and only if G's formal features are a proper subset of those G's probe P. Okay. So this slide illustrates Roberts' analysis of critics. So we have small v, which has unvalued phi features, and it finds phi in this position and it undergoes agree with phi. And as a result, phi min-max incorporates the small v. This is because phi's formal features, that is, phi features, are a proper subset of small v's. Okay. So moving on to my analysis. So in this section, I'm going to develop an analysis for the pronominal critics in Tocharian B. We reviewed in the previous section that the PCs can represent a theme or goal, a possessor, and so on. I argued that this is because a proof on P V can find a goal in these positions. First, I take the SOV order of Tocharian to be derived through the following 3 steps. First, we have roll-up movement of an internal argument, or maybe object shift to the middle field. And this is followed by head movement of small v to t, and then remnant movement of small vp to spec t. This is in line with Higman and others. This analysis has some consequences. So this analysis says that v and t actually do not form a constituent. This is in line with Zeiman and Kariboda's analysis on Latin verbs. An example of a pronominal critic spelling out the DO is illustrated here. So we have the structure of Paratai ne, you have praised him for 7 days. First, we have agree and incorporation. So phi, which is the internal argument, undergoes agree with small v and incorporates to small v. And then we have v to t movement, which is followed by remnant vp movement. V to t movement, and then remnant movement. As a result, we get the ordering subject, verb, followed by a critic. The next example illustrates the a sentence where a pronominal critic spells out an indirect object. So, Che, Shrok, Aksha, me, he proclaimed this shrove to them. So in this case, phi starts in the spec position of applicative P, and it undergoes agree and incorporation to small v. And then we have head movement of small v to t, and then small vp undergoes remnant movement to tp. V to t, and then remnant movement: subject, direct object, verb, and an indirect object, critic. This example illustrates a PC which spells out an inalienable possessor. So this is a structure for Cauchy new Kekzen if they chop up my body, and so on. So here we have phi min max, which starts as the complement of a noun body, and it first undergoes movement to the edge position of thin dp. And then this is phi values small v's phi features, and it undergoes incorporation. And then small v to t movement, followed by remnant vp movement, as illustrated in this slide. So far, I showed that PC incorporates to small v by agree, and it undergoes small v to t movement. And this is followed by a remnant movement of small vp to spec dp, and this derives the surface ordering. Since a probe searches for a goal in its C commanding domain, then it cannot agree with an external argument unless you assume a cyclic model of agree. So therefore, this analysis predicts that a PC cannot spell out an possessor associated with an external argument. So my prediction is stated in 5. So I have examined 424 examples of the PCs attested in this language. And so far, all of them are consistent with my analysis. That is, there are no examples in which a PC spells out a possessor associated with a transitive subject. I'd like to emphasize here that when a possessor, pronominal possessor when a pronominal possessor associated with a transitive subject is always spelled out as an orthotonic form, as in example 6. So here we have an orthotonic pronoun ni, which is associated with prochal, which is the subject of the transitive verb. So when my brother pulled out my eyes with violence, and so on. And furthermore, this analysis makes prediction, that is, if a proof exists above V, then an external argument can be proved, and it can be spelled out as a critic. And this prediction is also borne out as in 8 and 9. So a pronominal critic can spell out an agent of a transitive predicate participle as well as an infinitive. So let's look at these examples. So in this example, example 10, we have the plural critic me, which climbs to a finite copula takan, and it spells out an agent of the predicate participle kakraba assembled. So there are some living beings who have done a deed, and by reborn in hell, an evil deed will be accumulated by them. So here we have a critic me, which spells out an agent of this participle. The structure of this sentence is illustrated here. So I assume that there is a functional head voice, which is specified as passive, and this head has a set of unvaried phi features. So it looks for phi features, finds phi in spec small vp, and then this phi undergoes incorporation to this head. And the participial phrase raises to spec voice p. This is in line with Collins 2005. And then voice undergoes head movement to aux, and then aux undergoes to head movement to t. As a result, we have a complex verbal complex, which is spelled out as takam me. And then finally, aux p rolls up to the spec tp. The next example illustrates a pronominal critic spelling out an agent of an infinitive. So, and if he is necessary, he has to utter lie or gossip or senseless talk, and so on and so forth. So here we have the third person singular critic ne, which acts as the agent of this infinitive. So the structure of this sentence is illustrated here. First, we have small v, head moves to infinitive head, and then small vp raises to the spec position of this infinitive projection. And then we have external merge of modal heads, which has unvalued phi features, agrees with phi, and carries it to the T position. As a result, we have a verbal complex in T, and finally model P rolls up to spec TP. So far, I showed that the distributions of the PCs into K and B are more restricted than previously thought. That is, they cannot spell out a possessor of an external argument unless there is a host above small vp. And this analysis predicts that a PC can actually represent a subject of a transitive or intransitive verb when it is in appropriate configuration. In other words, when it is hosted by a finite verb above V. So this is my analysis, and it has some implications. So I predicted in the previous section that a pronominal critic cannot be associated with an external argument of a hosting verb. And this implies that when a PC is associated with a subject of an intransitive verb, and then the subject is not an external, but it is an internal argument. And it is commonly thought that we can recognize two classes of intransitive verbs. One is annegatives, and the other is unaccusatives. While annegatives pattern with transitives in that their subject is an external argument, that of unaccusatives is an internal argument. So therefore, the analysis I developed in the previous section has the following implication, which is certain. If a pronominal critic is associated with a subject of an intransitive verb, then the verb is unaccusative. We know that a pronominal critic can be associated with a subject of an intransitive verb, as in 14. So in this example, we have the first person singular critic nu, which represents the possessor of prosco, fear. So therein, I will hide in your protection, or father, so that my fear may rest. So according to my analysis, first person singular critic nu in this example is not a part of an external argument, but it is a part of the internal argument of llama, and the verb is therefore unaccusative. In contrast, a PC cannot be associated with an argument of a negative verb since it has not been merged to the structure yet. And this is significant because currently no methods are known to us which can separate unaccusatives from unnegatives into carrion. But my analysis allows us to single out unaccusatives into carrion B. So if a PC is associated with a subject of an intransitive verb, then the verb is unaccusative. And if this analysis is on the right track, then we should be able to find a PC associated with a subject of an intransitive verb whose unaccusative behavior is independently motivated. In this sense, Levin and Rappaport-Hobart study is important. They classify verbs which participate in causative inchoate ordination as externally caused verbs. Externally caused verbs include change of state verbs such as bake, back and break, and so on, and verbs of motion such as bounce, move, roll, and so on and so forth. According to them, all externally caused verbs are unaccusatives, while internally caused verbs are mostly unnegatives. Alexiadou and Anagnostopoulos' study also points in the same direction. So they divide modern Greek labile verbs into several subclasses. What is interesting here is that all of the subclasses agree in that they do not have a functional head which introduces an external argument. So in other words, they are all unaccusatives. And TB also has a set of labile verbs which attest both middle and active inflections, as illustrated in this table. So therefore, we can predict 18. That is, we should be able to find examples where a pronominal critic is associated with a subject of a middle labile verb. And this prediction is borne out. So in 19, we have the first person singular critic nu, which is associated with an omitted DP, which is the subject of the middle labile verb nansate, she bowed, or she bent herself. So my desire to disability, my desire about to disability and my life did not exist from my body. So to conclude, in this paper, I developed an analysis which accounts for the attested distributions of the pronominal critics in Tokyo B. And this analysis restricts the distribution of the PCs in Tokyo B in a falsifiable way. That is 20. Pronominal critics in TB cannot be associated with a subject of a transitive or a negative verb. Moreover, this analysis allows us to single out unacusatives by focusing on the distribution of pronominal critics. So if a pronominal critic is associated with a subject of an intransitive verb, then the verb is unaccusative. Finally, Adams 2015 noted that if both direct and indirect objects are pronouns, then the indirect object seems to be favored to become the enclitic pronoun. However, unfortunately, he didn't give any examples to support his observations, nor any possible explanation. The analysis I developed in this paper provides a natural explanation to his observation. The preference to spell out an indirect object over a direct object is due to a principle which states that a probe agrees with the closest available goal. And moreover, this analysis yields a strong prediction. That is, a direct object never becomes a pronominal critic if an eligible indirect object is present in the structure. But testing this prediction is a topic for a different opportunity. And thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tego, for the talk. We have approximately 9 minutes for questions. Again, you can either use the raise hand feature in the chat or type your question into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Let's see, we have a hand. Austin Miller.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was just wondering, since Tocharian was the area where Tocharian was spoken is adjacent to Tibet, given that Tibetan is an ergative language, I was wondering if maybe the pronominal clitic system could have been influenced, like by marking the objects, could have been influenced by Tibetan ergativity. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Thank you very much for your comment. I haven't looked into Tibetan at all, so at this moment I don't really have any feeling about this. But definitely, yes, I'm going to look into this. Yes, thank you very much.
Let's see. Still have about 8 minutes for questions or so. Questions. Well, give it another minute. Well, a little bit of time. Well, I suppose if there are no more questions up, okay. Question from Mike Brinkerhoff. I hope I said your name right, but you go ahead.
Don't worry, you said it right, Lamar.
Okay, gotcha.
Thank you so much for this talk. You were mentioning a little bit about how this might have some correlations with like treating it as like an object shift. Have you looked a little bit more into an analysis where it is similar to object shift? And if it is object shift, are you meaning more in the terms of like Scandinavian object shift, or Yeah.
Well, yes. So I haven't really figured out whether this is roll-up movement of internal argument coming before the verb, or it is do we have objective in this language? I don't really know at this moment, but it seems that in this language, direct object almost always precedes negation. So uh, it seems that it seems that an internal argument is not really in a verb phrase, but it is outside of the verb phrase. And
Mhm.
also, I couldn't have time to talk about this, but in this language has some critic doublings, and it seems that critic doubling is conditioned by specificity or something like that. And when critic is doubled, then associate is almost all. I would say associate is always outside of the verb phrase and preceding a bunch of adverbs. So this
Mhm.
looks to me we have a kind of object shift, but I need to look into this more in order to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, because this pattern looks very similar to the research I'm doing on Scandinavian object shift.
Oh,
And so
oh,
it seems like
interesting.
possibly there might be some correlations there.
Yeah, interesting. I'd like to know more about what is happening. Yeah, what is happening in is this object shift or something else? Or, yeah,
Mhm. Thank you.
thank you.
We have approximately 3 minutes left for questions. Hmm. Okay. If there are no more questions, I think we all can talk to Tego outside of here if we have anything else to discuss with him. Once again, Tego, we thank you for your presentation and your time. Definitely appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There is one question in the Q&A from Nikita. They say, have you compared this to clitics in other early Indo-European languages, and do you see any similarities in the other branches?
So yes, I have looked at critics in like Hittite or Vedic Sanskrit or Avestan. I briefly mentioned at the beginning of this talk, but they all target in the C region, so-called the Vakanago position. And in this sense, Tocharian is very different. It doesn't occur in the second position. It always occur after a finite verb. And also you can have like several pronominal critics. You can have do and io in Hittite or Vedic Sanskrit, but you can never do that in Tocharian. It is always one pronominal critics. When you have io critic, then you don't have a do critic. When you have a do critic, you don't have an io critic, or there's no distinction between io and do critic. So in this sense, also critics in Tocharian are different from critics in Hittite or Sanskrit or Avestan or Greek and so on. So I think that yes, changes must have happened, but how and when and why, these are just all of them are just unanswered at this moment. And in order to answer these questions, we need to have better understanding of what is really going on in this language, so that we can compare and we can build some possible hypotheses about changes. This is,
Hey, Lamar, we can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. Okay, we'll try this again. Can everybody hear me now? Yes? Okay. Can everybody hear me now? Are we good?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to our final presentation of the day, loan word markers and nouns and verbs, a comparative perspective, presented by Francesco Gardani from University of Zurich, Hugo Salgado and Justin Pinta from The Ohio State University.
Hello, hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Our apologies for the troubles at the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. All right. If I could ask, is this full screen, or can you guys see the presenter notes as well?
Looks like it's full screen to me.
Yep, full screen. So there's no the presenter notes aren't visible. All right. I just didn't know if I had to switch the. I'm on 2 monitors.
Yeah,
I can see your notes.
yes.
Oh, you can. Okay. I think I should be able to. How about now?
There you go.
Here we go.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. So in spite of what it says there, I'm actually Justin Pinta. I'm here with Hugo Salgado off to my right. We'll be switching up halfway through the presentation. Very unfortunately, Francesco is unable to join us last minute due to a COVID-related family emergency that came up. So our thoughts are very much with him and his family. It's also worth pointing out that we're kind of looking at 2 different things here, this comparative perspective between nouns and verbs. And Francesco is our expert on the verb portion of that. But Hugo and I are, of course, happy to to carry on in his stead. So yeah, so this is Loanword Markers and Nouns and Verbs, a comparative perspective. Just a little outline about what we'll be looking at in this talk. So we're going to do an overview of loanword accommodation types generally, and then kind of focus in on loanword markers specifically, because that's what we're interested in here. We'll look at the questions that were motivating our study and the kind of goals of what we're actually trying to accomplish today. And we'll then, of course, move on to a brief survey of loan verb markers and loan noun markers, and then we'll wrap up at the end. So starting with loanword accommodation types, much of what we'll be kind of talking about, in particular with regard to the verb portion of the talk, comes from Volgemuth 2009, which was an important book that did a deep dive on a lot of the things that we're interested in. Volgemuth proposed basically 4 different categories, a kind of typology of loanword accommodation types. So direct insertion, indirect insertion, this light verb strategy, and then paradigm insertion. And we'll take a look at all 4 of those really quickly. So yeah, so direct insertion is when the borrowed lexeme is immediately available for the grammar of the recipient language without any morphological or syntactic adaptation whatsoever being necessary to render it a native-like verb. So when recipient languages overtly mark infinitives or require some kind of piece of morphology in order to use a verb in a particular context, that's actually not what we're talking about here. Yeah, any type of morphological process that applies to both native and borrowed, and borrowed stems is going to be a different type of process. This is a process of, or what we're interested in here, what we're teasing apart in these 2 insertion strategies is, do you need some kind of morphological mechanism to show that something is borrowed? So that the morphological mechanisms to just, take an infinitive and turn it into a finite verb, for instance, is a different phenomenon. So indirect insertion is when the borrowed lexeme is overtly marked as a loan word. So of course, this is eventually what we're going to be interested in today. And this is, by means of some kind of morphology, affixes, that type of thing. The third strategy is this light verb strategy. So whenever the borrowed lexeme becomes part of a complex construction consisting of a so-called light verb. And in this case, the borrowed elements remain mostly uninflected, and they're more or less neutral with regard to their part of speech membership. Cross-linguistically, we often see this with verbs that would translate to do or to make. So, you borrow a verb from another language and then you say to do and then whatever that form is. This is this classic light verb strategy. And finally, we have paradigm insertion. Paradigm insertion is by far and away the least common cross-linguistically of these four. This is whenever, instead of morphological adaptation, a language just borrows a verb form along with significant parts of the donor language's verbal inflection. And this can only happen in situations of intense language contact, of widespread bilingualism in a community, because whenever this verbal morphology that's borrowed into the recipient language, it's still semantically useful, semantically transparent there. So the speakers of the borrowing language have to have access to the semantic properties of this morphology in these instances, which is why you only see that in situations of intense language contact, and why it's the least common of these four strategies, or types rather. We can see here that three of them are general accommodation types, and one of them is just for verbs. So obviously the light verb strategy there. So again, we're interested in here in indirect insertion, which again is whenever the borrowed lexeme is overtly marked in some type of way. And the marking, the actual morphology that they use to accomplish this is what we're calling loanword markers. And that's of course the topic of the talk today. So what are loanword markers? These are morphemes whose main function is integrating foreign lexemes and or signaling that a given lexeme is borrowed. We say main function because in some languages, in some examples, there will be other functions of these morphemes as well, but the primary one is to signal that a lexeme is non-native to the language. What lexical classes do they affect? Overwhelmingly verbs, but they also affect nouns, and they'll affect adjectives, as we'll see later as well. But yeah, primarily this is a verbal phenomenon. So yeah, what frequency do we see? It occurs most commonly in verbs, and this has been something that's been noted by all kinds of authors, that loanword markers on nouns and adjectives and adverbs and the like are cross-linguistically extremely rare. So looking at, this is a map from Vogelmuth. This is a geographic distribution based on a sample from 553 language pairs, basically contact scenarios, which whenever you clear, because some languages are represented more than once in different contact scenarios, after you kind of, the overlap cleared total this is a sample of 429 languages from 69 families. And this is of indirect insertion and specifically verbs only. And so we can see that this particular strategy occurs the world over, but is more common in Eurasia, for instance, than other places. So the questions motivating our study, these are basically what got us thinking about this. So why do most languages appear to borrow nouns more freely than verbs, and what factors determine this imbalance? How commonly are verbs borrowed directly as verbs, and how commonly must they first be borrowed as nouns and then kind of re-verbalized in the recipient language? What are the possible diachronic mechanisms and paths of verbal borrowing? Do these mechanisms depend on intralinguistic and or extralinguistic factors? Are these factors generalizable cross-linguistically? Are there universal constraints on verb borrowability? Obviously, lots of questions here, and it probably goes without saying that this is far beyond the scope of this particular talk, but nonetheless, we wanted to give the background about the kind of stuff that we have in our heads. What we specifically want to do today, the two goals, is provide a first survey of loan noun markers to complement the cross-linguistic survey given by Vogelmuth in 2009. And we'll see that there's not a whole lot to that first survey because this is such a rare phenomenon, but that will be what Hugo will be talking about here soon. And we also want to demonstrate the diachronic path of morphemes used as loanword markers, both in verbs and nouns. So talk a little bit about the diachrony of these things. So to start with a brief survey of loan verb markers, Yaqui is a Uto-Aztecan language which is spoken in Mexico, and it has this suffix oa, which is a loan verb marker, which it uses to accommodate loan verbs from Nahuatl and Spanish. And this is originally from Nahuatl. This oa is a class marker of a certain class of verbs. And after a certain amount of loans were borrowed into Yaqui from Nahuatl, they basically regularized this as just as a loan verb marker. And then upon that regularization, it was available for use for other languages as well, which is what we see here in this example one, a Spanish verb which was borrowed into Yaqui, and it was marked with this with this Nahuatl source morpheme, just to mark it as a foreign element. Oh, and that's, so this is I should have made more clear. This is the verb class marker to loan verb, marker path. A different path that we see as well is the infinitive to loan verb marker path. And in this case, this is exclusively used for loan verb marking, but it also does that work. This is the classic example of the Romance origin infinitival marker, which has been borrowed into many Germanic languages, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's actually not just even Germanic languages, lots of Indo-European languages as well outside the Germanic subfamily do this in addition. But for instance, if we take 2b, so we see this English loan implement, and then Dutch, in order to make this a Dutch verb, we see en, which is this native Dutch morphology there, and then there's this ed, and this ed is what we're interested in. This originally came from the Romance infinitival, was the Romance infinitival marker. It came specifically from French in this case, and we see the same thing in Swiss German. There's examples of this abound. Another pathway would be the perfective to loan verb marker pathway. So throughout the Balkan Sprachbund, there's this Greek perfective sa morpheme, which has been reanalyzed as is, and has become the kind of general integration suffix in many languages found in the Balkan Sprachbund. So here we see this Turkish source form. And so we see this Turkish source form, and then whenever it's adapted into Bulgarian, we get is. And even though that this is, again, Greek in origin, but here it's just been generalized to become a marker. And then here's another example from the Balkan Sprachbund. We see it in Serbian, a similar type of use of that morpheme. We also see an imperative to loan verb marker pathway. So this is the case of Korlai Portuguese, which is a Creole, which was formed around the middle of the 16th century and is now spoken on the west coast of India. It's in contact with this Indo-Aryan language, Marathi, and it's actually taken the imperative morpheme from Marathi and used it as a marker of non-native verbs. Finally, there's the verbalizer to loan verb marker pathway. So in this highly endangered variety of Romani, which is spoken in Greece and Turkey, we see loan verbs from Greek and Slavic languages are integrated via this borrowed morpheme in, which is a verbalizer in Greek, or at least originally comes from a verbalizer in Greek. It's not, I don't think, morphologically identical, but that's the original source. And again, this has been generalized such that even languages that aren't Greek, as we can see in 6b, such as this loan from Turkish, they still get this marker to show that this is a non-native verb. So just a quick observation, Wolgemuth proposes this kind of borrowing path of loan verb markers. And Wolgemuth only analyzed cases in which loan verb markers were originally infinitival markers. And so this actually holds for his data, but we're saying that we can expand this a little bit, that there are other sources of loan verb markers as well as some of the ones that we just saw. So perfectives can turn into loan verb markers, imperatives, infinitives can become loan verb markers without the intervening steps, etc. All right, and I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Hugo now.
Thank you very much, Justin. So now I will be talking about loanword markers outside of the verb domain. So as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, loanword markers of the type that we have been discussing so far are notoriously rare outside of the verb domain. And we actually find that this is true. In fact, despite of a very thorough research from our part, we were only able to identify 2 examples, including one from our own fieldwork. So if anyone in the audience knows a similar phenomenon in any other language, please let us know. We'll greatly appreciate it. Okay, so we move to our first case. So this is Spanish loan nouns in Choquita Tarahumara, this variety of Tarahumara. Tarahumara languages are a branch of the Uto second language family, spoken in northern Mexico. And in this variety, the suffix chi has locative meaning. For example, the first example from this variety, Norogachi Tarahumara, we see that the noun kawi with the locative has a locative meaning, like mountains as a place, right? And in Choquita Tarahumara, this other Tarahumara variety, we see the construction wasachi, which has the meaning of in the field. But interestingly, in this last variety, the suffix chi is used to accommodate many Spanish loan nouns, in which cases, according to the sources, it loses its locative meaning. So for example, we have Spanish barrica, bucket. It's adopted in this variety of Tarahumara as baricachi. And this has no locative meaning, so it's means plain bucket. Also from Spanish train is borrowed as trenchi, and Spanish harina is borrowed as harinchi. However, the sources also document several instances of loan nouns from Spanish that don't bear this accommodating suffix, this loanword marker. For example, manzana is borrowed as masana without the suffix chi. So we are unclear how productive this suffix is among modern speakers, and also if there's a difference between the forms that have the chi of the forms that don't have it. Maybe some are more recent than the others. It is, to this moment, is unclear. So the second case comes from our own fieldwork on Nahuatl, formerly known as Pipil. And Nahuatl belongs to the Nahuatl branch of Uto-Aztecan. So it's interesting that both languages that we see that have loanword marking outside of the verb domain are from the same language family, but this is entirely accidental. So Nahuatl is the only indigenous language of El Salvador, and it's highly endangered. So you can see here in this small map, this is a map of El Salvador. In green, you can see the original distribution spread of Nahuatl, and in the red circle, there were the communities in which it is currently spoken, and nowhere else in the world. So importantly, all living Nahuatl speakers are fully bilingual in Spanish, and they adopt Spanish loans faithfully. That means that they retain Spanish segments, phonological processes, stress patterns, and phonotactics faithfully, even though they may not be part of native Nahuatl phonology. But there is a big exception. Spanish loan nouns and adjectives that end in a vowel are consistently adopted in this language with an added glottal fricative. So this is actually the glottal phoneme of Nahuatl, and usually surfaces as breathy voice rather than a glottal fricative. So this added glottal segment does not occur with any other vowel final Spanish loanword classes, such as prepositions or given names or conjunctions, only with nouns and adjectives. So here's an example from our fieldwork. This is the phrase "ne candela pati," the candle melts. And here we can see the loan candela from Spanish candela, candle. So we can see that this is a faithful loanword because it retains the velar voiced stop. Here you can actually see it there, which is not native to the Nahuatl phonemic inventory. But you can see that at the end of and this is highlighted on Pratt, you can see that at the end of the word, you can see some frication noise that is characteristic of this glottal fricative. So it will be nice if you could be able to hear it, because I have an audio, but I don't know if you'll be able to. But well, anyways, we're gonna continue. So the following example is from another speaker, and it's "Tigne máquina Italia." We put it in the machine. So again, we have a loan noun from Spanish, máquina, from Spanish máquina, machine. And again, this is a faithful borrowing because it retains the stress patterns of the Spanish source with stress in the antepenult, which is not allowed in Nahuatl phonological grammar. So, but even though at the end of the word, you can see, and this one may be a little more tricky to see, you can see there is a glottal segment there. So instead of surfacing as frication noise, as we saw in the last example, it's actually surfacing as breathy voice. And you can see the periodic voicing waves with superimposed frication noise that is characteristic of breathy voice. So again, maybe, I don't know if you're able to hear it, but. And lastly, this is the last example, a very interesting one. Palnaga nuevos neiweiga. So in this case, we have a loan adjective from Spanish rather than a noun. So it means for its body to remain new, and we're talking about river crabs. So again, this is a faithful borrowing. It retains several aspects, phonological aspects of the Spanish source that are not allowed in Nahuatl phonology. For example, there's a complex onset in nuevo, and it even retains the Spanish phonological process of sparentization, by which voiced stop becomes an approximant in the intervocalic position. So you can see there in nuevo that there's no stop there, there's no closure, it's just an approximant. So it's a very faithful loan, but you can see at the end of it, again, there is this breathy voice. So this is the glottal segment that is added at the end of this loan adjective. Okay, so so what's the diachronic origin of this added glottal segment to Spanish loans in Nahuatl languages? So this happens and is attested in several other Nahuatl languages. So here's some of them. I believe that this is a pan-Nahuatl phenomenon, and we argue in the publication that we're working on with Justin that the origin of this sound is a loanword adaptation based on the perception of Spanish word final vowels by speakers of Nahuatl languages, including Nahuatl. So the speakers of Nahuatl languages perceive this glottal segment at the end of some vowel final Spanish words, and they adopt them with this glottal segment. But we don't believe that the synchronic analysis of this added glottal segment in modern Nahuatl is that of a loanword adaptation. Because in other Nahuatl varieties, we see that the addition of this glottal segment to vowel final Spanish loans decreases as fluency in Spanish increases. And this is completely normal in loanword adaptations. So the more fluent you are, in the donor language, the less you are likely to modify the loanwords, right? But in the case of Nahuatl speakers, that's actually true. We see that for most of the phonological structure of the loans is faithful to the Spanish source, with the exception of this added glottal segment. And speakers are very much aware of the inexistence of this glottal segment in the Spanish underlying forms. So they don't use them when they're speaking Spanish, of course. So rather, we propose that the synchronic function of this added glottal segment is accommodating vowel final Spanish loans and adjectives. So in other words, it has become a loanword marker for nouns and adjectives. Okay, so now we move to the conclusions. So this is a very preliminary survey. This is work in process, in progress. And in this very preliminary survey provides evidence to confirm that loan markers are more common in verbs than in non-verbs. And now we have two working hypotheses about why that is. So the part of speech related hypothesis is that as loan verbs often enter recipient language as non-verbs, when they are turned into verbs, this change has to be made visible by formal means. And also the processing related hypothesis, there's a robust, this is a quote by Seifert, that there's a robust cross-linguistic tendency for slower speech before nouns compared with verbs, both in terms of slower articulation and more pauses. So this is perhaps due to this property that nouns are easier to isolate and as a consequence to borrow and to integrate. So loan markers and verbs, as we saw, as Justin was saying, all of them ultimately derive from the inflection and morphology of a donor language, whereas loan markers in other parts of speech derive from other sources, as we see the native morphology of the receiving language, as we saw in the Choguita Tarahumara example, or in this case of Nahuatl, from a loanword adaptation. And thank you very much. That's our presentation. Do you have any questions?
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, we have approximately 7.5 minutes for discussion. Again, use the raise hand feature or the Q&A.
Yeah.
I see lots of people were talking about the notes that were visible. Our apologies for any of the weird. Yeah.
Q&A. Oh, yeah.
From last talk.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we have a question from Rosa. Hang on a second. Let's see. Go right ahead.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. This is fascinating work. Thank you. And I work with a couple of languages in the Amazon. One of those, I don't know if it's in your sample, it's Kokama. And in Kokama, the verbs are marked with a ushka, which comes from Quechua, which in Quechua is supposed to be perfective. So from the data that you showed, what it seems to be going on is that the markers themselves, the loan markers, come from a different system, not from the donor language, but from a third language. Is that what you have noticed? I don't think I've seen that in your conclusions, but it seems to me that this is kind of the pattern that it's emerging. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that comment, for that example. I think you're absolutely right that oftentimes we do see them coming from a third language, but I think we'd argue that it's still from a donor language of some sort, because they usually it's borrowed from this other language, from this third language in this case, via natural processes of borrowing, and then some morpheme is then regularized and then made available for use, not just for that language that they borrowed that morpheme from, but then from other languages that they might be in contact with. But you're right, what you're talking about, I guess we maybe glossed over that, but yours is a little more nuanced in the sense that, yeah, you're right, multiple languages can be involved, and in the case of once a language has a kind of loan verb marker in its morphological bag of tools, so to speak, then it can use that from the language that borrowed that from, or from other ones.
If I can follow up,
sure.
The thing in the Kokama case is that shka, it's used for nothing else but indicate loan marking. It hasn't entered the system as a spectral marker. So that my question is whether you see this going on in other areas as well. So I don't think it's a requirement that the marker has to enter the system first with an additional function and then become specialized as a loan marker. This is what I see in Kokama, whether you see that, or maybe you want to take a look at that possibility.
Yeah, I absolutely hear what you're saying. That's very very interesting. I wonder if Francesco were here, he might be able to shed more light on the cross-linguistic tendencies of that. But yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's absolutely something we should look into.
Wonderful, wonderful. Josefina, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep, and see you.
So my question is, so you're saying that cross-linguistically you see these markers more often in verbs than nouns, correct? Right.
Right.
How about within a language? I don't know if you mentioned this, and I'm sorry if I missed that. So, like, for example, like what Rosa was saying, and I guess I can extend this question to Rosa as well. So within a language, like, do you see this marker appearing only in verbs and not in nouns, for example?
Yeah, you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what's happening. All these cases that Justin has been talking about, these different diachronic pathways that lead to the development of these loanword markers in verbs occur only in the verbs. As long as as far as we know, there's no case in which one of these loanword markers that are exclusive to verbs starts being used on nouns.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And vice versa. I mean,
right.
the limited data we have about nouns, these languages that mark nouns these ways, that same morphology isn't available to mark verbs. So they seem to be very,
Exactly.
maintained separate.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty interesting.
Cool. All right, all right. Larry, your question is next.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
We can.
Thank you very much. Very interesting paper. From the discussion of the verb cases, I took the definition of a loan marker to be that it should be morphological. That is, it should be part of the inflectional system, as you showed, gets generalized as a marker. But when you got to the nouns and talked about the Spanish final vowel and the H and all that, it seems very different in such a way that, unless that's related to the final S in Spanish, that which I suspect not also, yeah. It then raises the question about what about other phonological properties that come in as a result of borrowing, as when many tone languages borrow words from English or Swahili and have to adjust the stress, and then you get tone patterns that otherwise don't exist in some cases because they're trying to approximate it. Would those be, in your mind, loan markers then? It would be a subset, of course. I don't know if it's ever been generalized to all loans, but of course I don't know in this case either whether that's, since typically you've had a one-to-one relationship, and not that that all loans, wherever they come from, get these markers?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Believe it or not, that's something that we thought about. We've been kind of working in this general area for a couple of years now, and it's something that we, yeah, exactly how we define it. Whether those types of cases, basically, you can get languages exactly what you're saying. The tone examples are perfect, where languages will come in, and if you get or loans will come in with a certain kind of phonological template. And if you can get a kind of critical amount of them, then all of a sudden you have a kind of stratum in the lexicon that is kind of marked as being foreign by its phonological characteristics. I think the question about whether we would call that a loanword marker in the way that we're defining it is it productive? So if you saw, a tonal language borrowing something from English, for instance, and then having some kind of particular tone pattern, if that tonal language were to borrow something from some other language from a different family, would they then use that same? Like, is it just a relic of the phonological adaptation process, or is it an actual, tool that speakers have by which to mark something? And one interesting little parallel that actually Brian Joseph gave us this idea. There's kind of like an orthographic version of this in early loans from Greek loans in Latin, where Latin didn't have the letter Y, and there was this stratum in which words that were written were Y were all came from Greek, and so it's kind of like a marker in the sense that you can tell which words are Greek on the basis of their orthography. But again, I think our ultimate question with those types of cases is it productive? And yeah. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if that was clear.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I had several other questions, but maybe another time, because it's such a fascinating area.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, in the Q&A, there was a comment about Cantonese having a loanword marker in nouns that use the diminutive tone by Justin Leung. I think it kind of went with what you all were discussing.
Oh, wow. Reference. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you very much for that, for the citation and everything. Yeah, we will absolutely look into this. We were earnestly hoping that there would be some examples from the audience of people saying, "Hey, I've seen this in other languages too." Thank you very much. We'll absolutely thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. I believe that's our time today. Ken, are we finished, or do we have like a minute, or are we done?
If we can do one more minute, do another question or two if you'd like.
Okay. All right. Well, if anybody else has a question, go ahead and feel free. Okay.
I'm going to write down that reference.
I'll give you all time to write that reference, like you said. Okay, there's another reference added in the chat from Rosa.
Great. It's great. Thank you so much. I'm writing those down right now, so thanks.
All right. So if that's our time, if that's all the questions and comments, I believe we can go ahead and wrap this session up. The session on Hispanic Linguistics #2. I thank you all for coming out. Thank you to our presenters, Josefina, Tego. We got Justin, Hugo, Francesco in his absence. Thank you all. This is all wonderful, and I learned quite a bit myself about things that I didn't know that I didn't know. So thank you all. For everybody else, have a good rest of your time here. Good weekend, and everybody stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.